In the final weeks of his life, witnesses claimed that no one could stay in Edward VI's chamber for long. The air inside was thick with a sour, suffocating heat that clung to the skin and made even hardened courtiers step back the moment they crossed the threshold. Servants whispered about the strange, wet rattle that echoed from his bed, a sound so unsettling it followed them down the corridor long after they left the room. And while no one dared speak openly, the palace understood that something far more disturbing was happening behind those doors than the court ever intended the country to know. And to understand why his end became so painful and frightening, we have to return to the moment this boy first entered the world. Edward VI is often remembered as a pale, sickly child who ruled England briefly and left little behind, but that picture hides the reality of a boy shaped more aggressively than any Tudor before him. To understand the king he became, and the collapse that followed, you have to start long before his reign and even before his earliest memories. His story begins in a country exhausted by political turmoil, desperate for stability and willing to build that stability on the shoulders of an infant who had no understanding of what was expected of him. Edward was born in October 1537, more than 20 years after Henry VIII first began searching for a male heir. England had endured annulments, executions, and religious upheaval driven by the king's determination to secure the succession. When Jane Seymour finally produced a living son, the relief was so overwhelming that the court shifted instantly into celebration. Bells rang across the country, bonfires were lit in the streets, and preachers said openly that God had forgiven England. But the triumph lasted less than 2 weeks. Jane's sudden death turned the atmosphere around the infant prince into something closer to national dread. Every person in the palace understood that the survival of the Tudor dynasty now depended entirely on a newborn who could not lift his own head. This fear shaped Edward's earliest environment. The nursery was transformed into a protected space where every movement of the prince was watched, recorded, and evaluated. Midwives and wet nurses were rotated constantly to prevent exhaustion, and physicians monitored his temperature, breathing, and appetite with the seriousness of men guarding the kingdom itself. Nothing about his upbringing resembled ordinary childhood. The adults around him lived in anticipation of disaster, and that anxiety created a world in which the boy never saw casual gestures, spontaneous laughter, or normal routines. The first years of his life taught him one lesson above all others: his existence carried weight far beyond anything he could understand. Henry VIII's involvement reinforced this atmosphere. Unlike his relationships with Mary and Elizabeth, which were marked by instability and political punishment, Henry treated Edward with unwavering devotion. He visited the nursery frequently, speaking of his son as if the child represented redemption for the entire country. Foreign diplomats noted that the king softened visibly in Edward's presence, a rare glimpse of vulnerability in a ruler known for volatility. But this affection carried an unintended consequence. Edward grew up not simply loved, but idealized. Every smile he received was accompanied by remarks about duty, destiny, and expectation. He learned early that people approached him with a mixture of fear and hope, never with honesty or equality. The structure of his education intensified this effect. When the time came to appoint tutors, the crown chose men whose purpose was not merely academic. They were strict Protestant reformers, sent to shape the boy into the monarch Henry imagined, intelligent, disciplined, and prepared to defend England's religious transformation. Lessons began early in the morning and continued without the play or exploration that normally broadens a child's understanding of the world. Edward learned languages, theology, and law, but he learned them through texts that emphasized conflict, righteousness, and divine authority. He absorbed the idea that kings ruled not by negotiation but by mandate, and that obedience was the natural response to power. Isolation completed the formation of his personality. Edward rarely interacted with other children, and those chosen to be around him were instructed to treat him with the same formality expected at court. Even in the rare moments when he played, the atmosphere remained cautious. No one argued with him, no one contradicted him, and no one treated him as an equal. His identity formed in a vacuum, shaped entirely by adults who believed they were preparing him for a role too important to be disrupted by ordinary childhood experiences. By the time he was old enough to articulate his thoughts, he had already learned to speak with a measured assurance that did not match his age. When Henry VIII died in 1547 and Edward ascended the throne at 9 years old, the transition appeared smooth. He stepped into kingship without the uncertainty or fear expected of a child in such a position. To those watching, it seemed as though he had simply walked into the role he had been trained for since birth. The council that governed in his name believed they would guide him gently while shielding him from the harsher demands of politics. What they did not yet understand was that Edward had absorbed the expectations placed upon him so completely that he no longer distinguished between his own will and the needs of the state. The boy they intended to protect had already internalized a version of authority that would shape every decision he made. His reign had not yet begun in earnest, but its trajectory was already set. The child England celebrated as its salvation had been molded into a ruler before he ever understood what ruling meant. And the pressures built into his life, pressure from his father, from the court and from the religious agenda surrounding him, were waiting to collide with the fragile body and untested judgment that defined the years ahead. When Edward VI began his reign in name, the men around him expected a quiet, controlled government in which the council would guide decisions while the child king learned statecraft gradually. Instead, they discovered that Edward had already developed a view of authority so rigid that even experienced statesmen hesitated to challenge him. The Tudors who had shaped his thinking had left him with no space for uncertainty. He believed that law, faith, and royal power were not subjects to be negotiated but forces to be enforced, and he saw himself not as a boy learning monarchy but as the monarch England had been waiting for. Edward's early council meetings revealed how swiftly he absorbed information and how little patience he had for nuance. Officials would present long reports about taxation, shortage of grain or diplomatic tensions with France, and he would respond with short, definitive commands. His confidence unsettled men who had governed through 2 decades of instability under Henry VIII. Foreign ambassadors wrote that the young king listened with unnatural composure, and that his judgments were delivered with a precision rare even in seasoned rulers. Edward did not raise his voice or display impatience. Instead he corrected ministers in a tone so calm it bordered on dismissive. To him, their concerns were practical obstacles to a moral mission, and he treated practical obstacles as problems that obedience could solve. His obsession with religious reform became the engine of his governance. Under Edward, England began a transformation faster and harsher than anything attempted under his father. Altars were torn down across the kingdom. Priests who resisted the new Book of Common Prayer were arrested. Images were stripped from churches in a sweeping purge that left many communities hollowed and bewildered. Edward saw these actions not as disruption but as purification, and he demanded their enforcement with a determination that made compromise impossible. Reports of resistance angered him, not because he feared rebellion, but because he believed disobedience threatened the divine order he had been raised to defend. The consequences soon became visible. In the West Country, villagers revolted against the new prayer book, demanding the restoration of traditional rites. Their uprising escalated into full violence. Edward, reading the reports, dismissed their grievances with the certainty of someone who had never been contradicted. He ordered the rebellion crushed, and the result was a massacre that left hundreds dead. To the king, this was not cruelty. It was evidence that God rewarded firmness. To the nation, it was the moment when the boy on the throne showed how far he was willing to go to protect the ideological structure built into him. Economic pressures added strain. Years of inflation and bad harvests had already unsettled the population, and the destruction of church property removed one of the few remaining social supports for the poor. When riots erupted over wages and food shortages, Edward reacted with the same stern confidence. He urged faster reforms, stricter punishments, and clearer demonstrations of royal authority. He believed that the instability proved the country needed stronger guidance, not gentler policy. What frightened those around him was the realization that he did not distinguish between civil unrest and spiritual rebellion. To him, both required the same response: discipline. Even within the council, the tension grew. Men who once assumed they would govern England through the prince now found themselves adjusting their strategies to avoid provoking the king's disapproval. In private letters, several ministers warned that Edward's education had produced a ruler who relied more on doctrine than on dialogue. They noted that he studied execution orders with detached interest, asked about the legal justification for harsher penalties, and spoke openly about purging corruption wherever he found it. These were not the interests of a child. They were the instincts of someone who had been prepared for absolute power long before he understood what its consequences looked like. But behind this appearance of authority, cracks were forming. Edward's long hours of study and governance left him pale and exhausted. His tutors observed moments of fatigue he tried to hide, brief lapses in concentration, and a growing rigidity in his posture. He ignored these signs, convinced that duty outweighed discomfort. For a time he was right. His determination allowed him to push through schedules that would have overwhelmed older kings. But the pressures he imposed on himself, pressures built from the expectations placed upon him since birth, were slowly beginning to collide with the limits of his youth. By the end of his second year on the throne, England was no longer governed by a child surrounded by advisors. It was governed by a child who believed he already understood how the country should be rebuilt, and who treated every challenge as proof that he must push harder. The nation was moving forward under a leadership that combined the intensity of a reformer with the inexperience of a boy, and the consequences of that combination had only begun to appear. The forces shaping England were becoming heavier, the cracks widening, and the first faint tremors of instability, political, social, and physical, were beginning to form around a king whose certainty left no space for caution. By the third year of Edward VI's reign, the optimism that once surrounded the young king had thinned into something colder. What began as confidence hardened into inflexibility, and the machinery of the state strained under the weight of a ruler who could not imagine that he might ever be wrong. England was no longer adjusting to a child on the throne. It was adjusting to a system that revolved entirely around his convictions. The council that expected to guide him found itself reacting instead to the speed with which he pushed reforms across every corner of the realm, and the nation began to understand that the stability promised by a male heir had delivered a different kind of uncertainty. The first major shock came with the Prayer Book Rebellion of 1549. Villagers in Devon and Cornwall rose against the new religious program, demanding the restoration of Latin rites that had shaped their communities for centuries. What frightened the court was not the scale of the uprising but the king's reaction when he read the petitions. Edward dismissed the rebels as enemies of God, writing in his journal that such defiance required the sharp remedy of justice. There was no hesitation, no attempt to understand the desperation driving people who had lost their traditions, security, and hope. He ordered the rebellion crushed, and the army responded with lethal force. Hundreds were killed in fields soaked with a combination of panic, anger, and disbelief. To Edward, the bloodshed meant the country had been cleansed. To England, it was the first sign that the boy on the throne saw dissent as contamination rather than suffering. The unrest spread. Riots over wages and food shortages erupted across East Anglia. Inflation rose sharply after years of currency debasement, and entire regions struggled to feed themselves as harvests faltered. Edward responded with the same certainty he applied to religious reform. He demanded harsher enforcement of vagrancy laws and issued commands with a decisiveness that suggested he saw social collapse not as a warning but as evidence that the kingdom needed stricter moral discipline. Ministers attempted to explain the economic causes behind the unrest, but they were met with cool dismissal. The king emphasized righteousness over practicality, and the gap between ideological purity and real-world suffering widened. Inside the government, tensions reached a breaking point. The protector Somerset, who had once believed he could manage the young king, lost control of the situation as factional conflict deepened. Many nobles resented his policies and feared the instability growing across the country. Yet what truly destabilized the administration was Edward's growing impatience with anything resembling moderation. He questioned decisions with the sharpness of someone who believed moral clarity was more valuable than political skill. His notes reveal an irritation with council members who urged gradual change. They were obstacles in his eyes, men too weak to understand what divine mission demanded. Foreign observers grew unsettled. Ambassadors from France and the Empire reported that Edward's demeanor lacked the emotional range expected of a child. They described a seriousness that seemed almost unnatural, a steadiness that did not soften even in private. One ambassador wrote that the king speaks as though all argument has already been concluded, and another warned that the boy possessed a conviction that could drive the nation into deeper conflict if left unchecked. Their reports circulated quietly among European courts, fueling concerns that England was being steered by a monarch whose youth made him blind not to danger, but to doubt. The pressure on Edward himself was becoming visible. He worked long hours, pushing through briefings and religious debates with the intensity of someone who could not allow himself to slow down. Servants noted fatigue in his movements, a growing stiffness in his posture and a paleness that deepened with each passing month. Physicians attributed it to overwork, advising rest he refused to take. Those closest to him observed subtle changes. He coughed more often, he paused longer before standing, and his voice occasionally thinned as if strained. But none of these signs suggested imminent danger. They appeared to be the natural consequences of a king carrying responsibilities far heavier than his age allowed. Yet the symptoms did not fade. By late 1551, Edward experienced sudden fevers that left him drained for days. He concealed them as best he could, insisting on meetings and readings even when visibly weakened. His determination to continue governing masked the deeper problem. The stress of maintaining control over a fracturing nation was colliding with a body that had never been strong. Each flare of illness passed, but each one left him slightly more fatigued, slightly more gaunt, slightly more aware that something inside him was beginning to fail. England did not yet know it, and Edward would not admit it, but the kingdom was entering a new phase of crisis, one in which political pressure, religious conflict, and physical decline were merging. The boy who had shaped England with conviction was beginning to feel the first tremors of a collapse he believed he could outwork. And the men around him were only starting to realize that the stability they fought to preserve rested on a body that was starting to give way. By the beginning of 1552, the pressure that had reshaped England was beginning to turn inward. Edward VI had pushed his reforms with such absolute certainty that the country's political structure started to fracture under the weight of decisions made by a monarch who refused to slow down. But the tension inside the government was nothing compared to the deterioration taking place inside the king himself. What had begun as periodic exhaustion was becoming a pattern of weakness that even he could no longer ignore. The boy who had treated fatigue as an inconvenience now found himself fighting symptoms that no amount of determination could push aside. The first clear sign came with a violent bout of fever that struck him during a council meeting. Witnesses described the king suddenly gripping the edge of the table, his face drained of color as sweat gathered along his temples. He insisted on continuing the session, dismissing offers to summon his physicians, but his voice thinned until the meeting had to be cut short. When he returned to his chambers, he collapsed onto the bed and spent the next 48 hours in a haze of chills and overheating, drifting in and out of coherence. Court physicians attributed it to a respiratory infection, assuring the council that the king would recover. But the recovery did not come. Every time the fever passed, another episode followed, closer and stronger than the last. Edward resisted rest with the same force he had shown in government. He demanded documents, orders, and reports delivered to his bedside, determined to project control even as his body betrayed him. But the effort only accelerated his decline. He began coughing with increasing violence, each spasm leaving him gasping for air. Ministers noticed that his once precise handwriting grew shaky, and his journal entries, previously sharp and authoritative, became brief, fragmented, and haunted by a tone of urgency he had never shown before. His confidence had not disappeared, but it had shifted into something more fragile, a conviction that he had limited time to complete the work he believed God expected of him. Outside the king's chamber, panic spread quietly. Nobles whispered that Edward's health was deteriorating far faster than the court admitted. Foreign ambassadors reported that he appeared thinner every week, his cheeks sunken and his posture weakened. Rumors reached Europe that England's long-awaited male heir was dying. The council, desperate to prevent political chaos, tried to suppress these reports by assuring foreign courts that the king was improving. But the truth could not be hidden inside the palace. Servants carried trays of untouched meals away from his bedside. Physicians replaced sheets stained with sweat and blood. The smell of illness, faint at first, began filling the room. Edward's decline accelerated as spring approached. He no longer walked the palace corridors but was carried between rooms by attendants who struggled to hide their alarm at how light he had become. His ribs became visible beneath his clothes, and he suffered sudden coughing fits that left streaks of red on his handkerchiefs. Each episode forced physicians to gather in hurried consultations, their expressions tightening as they examined the symptoms they tried to describe with restrained politeness. They called it consumption, infection, or weakness of the lungs, but none could deny that the king was fading. Despite this, Edward's determination hardened into desperation. He issued orders from his bed that the reforms must continue, that the kingdom must not waver, that the work he had begun was too important to abandon. Ministers followed his commands, not out of loyalty but out of fear that acknowledging his failing health would plunge the nation into a succession crisis. The question of who would inherit the throne hung over every council meeting like a storm the government had no power to disperse. Mary, the Catholic heir, threatened to reverse everything Edward had built. Elizabeth represented a future none could predict. And the dying boy in the next room insisted that England must not deviate from the path he had forced upon it. Edward's moments of clarity became shorter. He drifted between lucidity and exhaustion, sometimes speaking with the sharpness that once defined him, other times struggling to breathe. The confidence that had shaped his reign now appeared in flashes of fear. He asked his physicians why his strength did not return, why God allowed his body to fail when his mission remained unfinished. The doctors offered comforting lies, but Edward did not believe them. He had been raised to interpret discomfort as a test, but this was no test. This was collapse. When they arrived, the truth could no longer be concealed. Edward was dying. The boy who had ruled with such unbreakable certainty now lay trapped in a body that no longer obeyed him, his lungs filling with fluid, his breath turning shallow and inconsistent. The council began drafting emergency plans in case he did not survive the summer. And the kingdom he had shaped with unyielding confidence braced for a future built not on his ideals, but on the consequences he left behind. The king who once believed that divine purpose protected him was about to discover that conviction offered no defense against the failure of the flesh. By June 1553, the king's chamber had become a sealed world of fever heat and stale air, a room where the smell of lingering sickness clung to every fabric and made even seasoned attendants hesitate before entering. Edward VI, once the center of a kingdom built around his certainty, now lay trapped in a body so weakened that breathing itself had become an exhausting ritual. The decline that had begun quietly in the spring had transformed into a relentless collapse that everyone around him felt but no one dared describe openly. His lungs had grown dangerously congested, producing a heavy, suffocating sound each time he inhaled. Servants reported hearing the noise even from the adjoining corridor, a wet and rattling drag of air that made listeners instinctively hold their own breath. Physicians tried to mask their alarm by speaking calmly, but their eyes betrayed the truth. They recognized the pattern. The king was no longer merely ill, he was fighting against a body that was shutting down with increasing speed. The heat in the room, held in place by shuttered windows and constant burning of scented herbs, only deepened the oppressive atmosphere. Edward attempted to maintain control, asking for documents and insisting on receiving council members, but each attempt left him trembling. His voice had deteriorated into a broken whisper, strained by the effort of pushing air through lungs that no longer expanded fully. Even sitting upright required attendants to brace his shoulders, and the moment they released him, he sank back into the mattress, exhausted. His once steady hands shook visibly, and the effort of holding a pen caused the ink to trail in thin, uneven lines across the page. As his condition worsened, the council entered a state of controlled panic. Ministers gathered outside his chamber, speaking in low tones about the succession crisis looming over England. Every hour the king remained alive bought them time, every hour he worsened increased the pressure. Yet when they entered his room, they forced expressions of calm, bowing respectfully while trying not to show how shocked they were by his appearance. Edward's face had become sharply defined, his features thinned by weeks of fever. His lips darkened from lack of oxygen, and his eyes, once clear and alert, now drifted with a distant, glassy focus that made it impossible to tell whether he was fully aware of his surroundings. But the most disturbing moments came during the coughing attacks. They struck without warning, folding his already frail body into spasms that shook the bed. Each attack left him choking for breath, fighting to pull air into lungs that responded only with a harsh, bubbling sound deep inside his chest. Servants froze during these episodes, powerless to help. The physicians applied warm cloths, cold cloths, compresses, mixtures of spices and heated oils, but nothing opened his lungs. The room held its breath with him, waiting for the spasms to end, terrified that one would last too long. By the final week, the smell of fever could no longer be disguised. Despite constant changes of bedding, a sour, heavy scent lingered across the chamber, a sign familiar to anyone who had witnessed prolonged illness. The combination of heat, sweat and stagnant air created a closeness that settled on the skin of everyone inside. Courtiers left the room pale, shaken not only by the king's decline but by the oppressive atmosphere itself. Even the guards stationed at the door shifted uneasily, aware that something irreversible was unfolding only a few steps away. Edward's final political act came when the council placed the device for the succession before him. He had to be supported by attendants just to lift his head. With trembling concentration, he traced the lines of the document, insisting that England must follow the path he had built. Signing his name required both hands steadying his wrist, and even then the letters wavered as if dragged by an invisible weight. It was the signature of someone fighting not only illness, but time. In the last hours of July 6, his breathing grew shallow, each inhale separated by long pauses that filled the room with dread. Those present later described the sound as a slow drowning from within, a soft but unmistakable struggle as air failed to pass through lungs clogged beyond remedy. Edward's eyes opened briefly, wide with the instinctive panic of someone who cannot draw enough breath, before drifting closed again as exhaustion overtook fear. Then, in a final sequence that seemed to stretch endlessly, his chest rose in a long, trembling motion, held there for several seconds, and fell. A second attempt followed, weaker and shorter. The third barely lifted his ribs. After that, there was no movement. The boy who had ruled England with unwavering certainty had died not by violence or treachery, but by the quiet suffocation of a body unraveling from within. The council hesitated for several minutes before speaking, stunned by the stillness. When the news finally spread through the palace, it carried with it the same chill that had hung in the king's room throughout his final days. Edward VI had died at 15, leaving behind a kingdom unprepared and a legacy defined not by triumph but by the haunting memory of a death more prolonged, more suffocating and more horrific than England had ever been told.